This is the multi-voice text-to-speech podfic reading of I Put a Spell on You by MsAlexWP, composed by Burning Aurora. Chapter 1, quoth the Raven.
Follow me. Mind the graves.
The man turned with a swish of his long woolen cloak and pushed open a creaking iron gate, stepping into the dark graveyard with his lantern raised. His black buckled boots crunched over fallen leaves that blanketed the dying grass and winding gravel paths. The air was cool and crisp, and the north wind whistled through the skeletal trees that cast long, spidery shadows across the graves in the silvery moonlight. They followed the bobbing lantern light as it wound through the rows of crumbling graves, some broken, some sinking sideways into the ground, all telling of souls that once called this place home. Finally, the man stopped abruptly in front of a dark slate stone beneath a twisting, gnarled maple tree. He lowered his lantern, and a winged skull carved into the stone's face flickered into view. It was a macabre thing, harsh in its stark depiction of human death. Hollow eyes, bared teeth, and angel wings protruding strangely from the sides of the curved skull. It was lichen-covered, ancient and cracked, decaying like the bones themselves that laid beneath their feet. Dust to dust.
You are standing
The man said.
At the grave of John Hawthorne, notorious judge of the Salem witch trials who helped to condemn 19 innocent people to the gallows and who never apologized for his terrible actions. His earthly remains lie here, in this cemetery. But what of his soul? What happens to souls that are stained with the blood of others? Are they drowned in fiery lakes of brimstone, as the Puritan ministers preached from their high wooden pulpits? Or are they languishing elsewhere, drowned in torment and guilt, suffering in a different kind of hell?
Something like this stupid fucking tour, perhaps?
Sirius Black jumped at the voice in his ear and turned to see a pearly white, translucent old man dressed in the same manner as the man holding the lantern. He wore a long woolen cloak over black breeches, a buttoned vest, black leather boots, and a tall, narrow-brimmed hat. He leaned against a tree with his arms crossed over his chest and an annoyed look on his harshly lined, weather-worn face as he glared at the tour guide who was now speaking of poppets and witches and midnight dances with the devil.
John Hawthorne.
The tour guide continued, gesturing at the gravestone again with his flickering lantern. The ghost stamped his foot, then marched right up to the tour guide so they were nose to nose and balled his hands into angry fists.
Hathorne.
The ghost bellowed in the man's face.
My name is Hathorne. Do you see a W in there, you squirrel-brained buffoon?
He turned and pointed angrily at the carving of his name on the gravestone, which Sirius now saw did indeed say Hathorne, not Hawthorne. In that moment, the tour guide's lantern blew out, but they weren't plunged into darkness. Far from it. In addition to the streetlights, there were at least 7 other lantern-led tours happening around them in the same cemetery.
Whoops. Wind must have got it.
The tour guide laughed, relighting the lantern with a lighter pulled from his cloak pocket.
Or perhaps it was the tormented ghost of John Hawthorne.
You bloody fucking moron.
Ghost yelled, louder and more angrily this time. The tour guide flinched and shivered, running a hand across the back of his neck and looking around blankly, before continuing with his talk.
John Hawthorne was born in,
he said, and the ghost shrieked with rage.
Shut up.
The ghost yelled in his face, and flickers of pearlescent spittle flew from his mouth.
Shut up, shut up.
Berlin's balls, you shut up.
Lily Evans hissed, flinging her hair over her shoulder in a huff.
I'm trying to learn something here.
You're learning lies.
The ghost bellowed.
How can you trust anything he says when you can't even trust him to pronounce my name correctly? This city has gone to hell.
And with that, the ghost kicked through the tour guide's shin with his black leather boot and sank into the dark ground with one last angry screech, leaving behind a shimmer of pearly white wisps that dissolved into the October night sky. Lily rolled her eyes.
Drama queen.
She muttered and returned her gaze to the tour guide, who turned his back to them with another theatrical swish of his cloak and flourish of his lantern, beckoning them to follow.
Come.
The guide said in a dramatic rasp.
I shall show you the place where Giles Corey was pressed to death in a field under the weight of a dozen heavy stones.
They waited for the rest of their tour group to move, then followed the tour guide out of the graveyard and back into the cobblestone street. Sirius followed reluctantly, glancing at a drawing of an ugly, cartoonish witch covered in warts leering at him from a shop window, and thought that the huffy ghost had a point. Salem, Massachusetts, Sirius could confidently say was highly overrated. Sirius wasn't sure what he was expecting when he and Lily had arrived in Salem for an autumn besties break, as she'd called it. But whatever it wasn't this theme park, fake witchcraft hellscape, where cheap plastic pumpkins and oversized hairy spiders clung to lampposts and animatronic witches and demons cackled stupidly around every corner. Sirius supposed the brick-lined streets might have been pretty, had they not been crowded with sweaty, grumpy muggles, packed shoulder to shoulder and wearing the stupidest outfits Sirius had ever seen. Everywhere he looked were middle-aged suburban mums in enormous conical witch hats, adorned with billowing lace and gigantic feathers that obstructed every view and poked Sirius in the eye. There were people in rubber clown masks carrying plastic chainsaws through the streets, and about 100 Winifred Sandersons clutching toy broomsticks and scratching their scalps beneath their red wigs.
Everyone here is lame,
Sirius grumbled as he eyed a sullen-looking teen whose eyes were ringed with black eyeliner, and who stomped menacingly down the street in heavy black combat boots, ripped black jeans, and a black leather jacket. Lily snorted.
You're kidding, right?
She asked, looking the teenager up and down.
You're wearing the exact same outfit.
Yeah, but mine's authentic. That
Sirius bristled, pointing at the teen's leather-clad back.
is cosplay.
Lily rolled her eyes.
Oh, right, sorry.
She said, then put a finger to her temple and looked to the sky in deepest contemplation.
Remind me again, how many more leather jackets and bottles of black nail varnish do you think your trust fund at Gringotts could buy?
There were long, obnoxious queues for everything. Every restaurant, every shop, even the fucking cemeteries. And Sirius tagged along grudgingly, dragging his feet and kicking pebbles while Lily pulled him into every single one of them. Sirius tried to make the best of it. He really did. On the second day, he spotted a handsome, purple-skinned vampire sitting on a wooden bench on a side street and attempted to make conversation while he waited for Lily to finish her tarot reading. But the vampire merely gave him a dirty, side-eyed look and breathed a mouthful of cigarette smoke into Sirius's face.
I'm on a smoke break, so keep it moving, pretty boy.
He rasped, adjusting his fangs with a long, pointed red fingernail. Sirius's fingers flexed longingly toward the wand in his inner jacket pocket, and he fantasized about casting one tiny little hex that would give this violet-skinned bellend the skin of a real vampire for a little while. Not long enough for him to actually crumble to dust in the sunlight, of course, but enough time to give him a painful, ashy blister or two. Instead, Sirius settled for pedantic petulance.
Yeah, well, vampire skin isn't purple.
He spat.
And your stupid plastic fangs look fucking fake as hell.
Sirius stalked away, almost crashing into a green, bolt-necked Frankenstein who was playing Roblox on his phone and not looking where he was going. Sirius hadn't used his wand in days and was losing his mind without real magic. The Magical Congress of the United States of America had a strict rule against real witchcraft being used in downtown Salem, even going so far as to forbid real witches and wizards from living or opening a business there. As such, Salem's visitors were divided into two groups: Muggles, who thought the witchcraft they encountered was real, and a handful of actual wizards who visited Salem as though it was a colorful, whimsical theme park, the equivalent of strolling through the France Pavilion at Epcot. Sirius didn't like Epcot either.
We have appointments at 3 p.m. to get our aura photos taken.
Lily said on the third day, glancing at her watch before opening her guidebook and looking around to get her bearings.
The shop is that way.
Lily, Sirius was disappointed to see, was leaning fully into the Salem in October aesthetic. It was a far cry from her usual sarcastic and skeptical demeanor, and Sirius wondered what in the hokey fake witch hell was happening to his best friend. She wore a brown woolen jumper with a bright orange jack-o'-lantern grinning from the front, a brown corduroy mini skirt, ghost-patterned orange tights, and brown leather boots. A headband topped with a glittery, green miniature witch hat pulled her long, auburn hair away from her face, and enormous spider earrings grazed her shoulders. She even insisted on stopping to buy what seemed to be a mandatory accessory in New England in the fall, a pumpkin spice latte.
It's delicious.
She exclaimed after her first sip.
She's cute, isn't she?
The barista gushed as Sirius watched Lily walk toward the coffee shop door.
Hurry up.
Lily called over her shoulder, scowling at Sirius's obvious reticence.
Yeah, adorable.
Sirius said, and followed her out into the street. They pushed past the long, crowded queue.
We have appointments. We have appointments.
Lily assured everyone who shot them dirty looks as they queue jumped and stepped into the dimly lit shop. Sirius sneezed immediately. The smell of incense was overwhelming, and as if that wasn't bad enough, the shelves were packed with teas and tinctures with stupid names like Red Hot Love Magic Essence and Money Manifester. There were voodoo doll hex kits and bottles of $30 moon water, whatever that was. Sirius looked up to see Lily eyeing a fake crystal ball and shook his head at her unbridled and frankly embarrassing enthusiasm for this foolish parody of wizarding life.
This is cultural appropriation.
Sirius said.
I'm picking the holiday spot next time.
You're so dramatic.
Lily replied, before smiling at a woman who emerged from a back room through a beaded curtain.
Hello.
Lily said.
We're here for our 3 o'clock aura photo appointment.
Of course, welcome.
She said dreamily, waving her hands over her head. She looked remarkably like Professor Trelawney, but somehow even more gauzily maniacal, with her long, flowing gown and shawls, hands and wrists full of silver rings and bracelets, and a crown of dried flowers sitting atop her head.
This way?
The woman said, leading them past bowls of crystals and bundles of herbs to a photo booth in the corner of the shop. She pulled aside a curtain, gestured them inside, and instructed them to press the purple button and think about infinity while they looked up at the camera.
What's that supposed to mean?
Sirius asked as he and Lily slid onto the narrow bench together.
Can you stop asking so many questions and just go with it?
Lily huffed, leaning forward to press the button. She looked at the camera with a cheesy smile, but they didn't have time to think about infinity. Instead, the camera lens cracked with a soft pop and started emitting thin tendrils of pink smoke. Then there was another pop, this one a tiny explosion, and pink flames licked behind the cracked glass.
Not again!
The shopkeeper cried, as Lily and Sirius scrambled out of the photo booth, and another employee pointed a fire extinguisher at the blaze.
And right at the beginning of October, too.
Come on.
Sirius said in a low voice, pulling Lily by the hand toward the door before the shopkeeper could ask them too many questions. They should have known that their magic would make a Muggle device go haywire. They shuffled back into the crowded street, and Lily looked around helplessly.
Now what do we do?
She whined.
The aura photo session and interpretive tea reading ceremony were supposed to be 90 minutes long. We don't have anything else planned until the broomstick making class at 5.
Before Sirius could ask how such drivel could have possibly taken 90 fucking minutes, two strange things happened at once. An inky black raven appeared out of nowhere against the bright blue sky and swooped low over the sidewalk with a deafening screech and flap of feathers.
Holy shit!
Sirius breathed, grabbing Lily by the collar and yanking her to the ground as the bird dive-bombed their heads. They looked up to find their avian attacker, but the raven was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a $100 bill fluttered to the ground and landed at their feet.
Merlin, look.
Lily laughed.
Muggle money's falling from the sky.
She took a step forward and reached out a hand to pick it up, when a gentle breeze rushed through the trees, rustling the dry leaves and making the money blow a few feet down the sidewalk. They followed it a couple of steps and tried to pick it up again, but once more the wind kicked up and blew it away, and again, and again.
Well, now I'm in a battle with nature and I must win,
Lily declared, chasing the bill down the street. The faster she moved, the faster the money blew away. They ran and ran, laughing so hard that they didn't notice that the crowds of people around them were thinning, that the sounds of trolley bells and the chatter of tourists were fading, that the bricks and cobblestones lining the street were becoming uneven, buckling and cracking with disrepair. Finally, a mighty gust rolled through the street and sent the $100 bill spinning up into the air in a miniature tornado of paper litter and dry leaves. They stopped short, watching it spin and whoosh until it was sucked sideways down a narrow alleyway that Sirius hadn't noticed before. Lily walked quietly down the little side street and stopped in front of the $100 bill, which now sat motionless on the ground at her feet at the bottom of 3 granite steps. The alley was so narrow, they could have touched the walls of both brick buildings by barely stretching out their arms. Lily bent down to pick up the money, and for once it didn't fly away.
Who do you think this bloke was?
Lily asked, eyeing the half-bald man on the curious paper muggle note. She looked at Sirius, expecting him to be looking at the money too. But he wasn't. Instead, he was looking up at a small wooden sign hanging from an iron bracket with the words, "Quoth the Raven," in black, wood-burned letters. Sirius took a step closer to the building, which he could see now was a small shop with mullioned windows and tiny panes of rippling glass that Sirius struggled to see through.
We should go in there.
Sirius said, peering through the window at the tiny shop, his fingertips pressing against the glass without even realizing it.
Looks cool.
Quoth the Raven.
Lily said, reading the sign and flipping to her guidebook's index.
It's not in the guidebook.
Even more reason to go inside.
Sirius replied, and before Lily could protest, he was climbing the stone steps, pushing open the shop's heavy wooden door and stepping inside. Almost immediately, Sirius sensed something different about the place. Most of the displays were similar to every other shop in Salem. There were t-shirts and postcards, witch hats and spell kits, candles and bundles of herbs. But there were other things scattered amongst the tourist bric-a-brac. Stacks of heavy leather-bound books, carefully curated vintage hats and jewelry, glass cloches filled with colorful mounted insects, Venus flytraps and cacti, delicate animal skeletons, unlabeled glass jars of what Sirius guessed was candy, and even a taxidermized bat. And there was something else, too. Something that Sirius couldn't quite put his finger on. A scent, or a feeling, maybe, that tingled and buzzed, pulling him deeper into the shop.
Want to see a magic trick?
The voice crackled straight up Sirius's spine, and his head whipped around to see where in the little shop it was coming from. His eyes landed on a man with honey-brown curls, golden skin, and silvery scars that slashed across his neck and face. He was impossibly handsome, and Sirius's breath whooshed out of his lungs when the man smiled and leaned across the counter on his elbows, looking at Sirius with a gaze that could melt gold. Sirius could think of a million tricks he'd like to see this man perform.
All right.
Sirius said, and walked over to the counter. The man grabbed a plastic pen from a chipped ceramic mug next to an old-fashioned metal cash register and twirled it between his long fingers before laying it flat on the wooden countertop.
Ready?
The man asked, and Sirius nodded, unsure whether he wanted to watch the man's beautiful hands or his beautiful face. But the trick happened too fast for Sirius to decide. The man passed his hand over the counter, and in an instant the pen had disappeared, replaced by a tiny gray mouse, which scurried across the counter for a moment before the man scooped it into his cupped hands and dropped it into a little cage that he pulled out from underneath the counter. Clearly, he'd done this trick before.
Wow. Impressive.
Sirius said.
Almost like real magic.
The man regarded him a little curiously and raised an eyebrow at him.
Well, Salem's a magical place.
He said simply.
This your first time here?
Yes.
Sirius said. He nodded over at Lily, who was in a far corner of the shop trying on hats in the mirror.
My best mate and I thought we'd come in October, see what all the fuss was about.
What do you think so far?
Sirius hesitated before answering.
Fine, I guess.
He said finally. The man's lips quirked into half a smile that made Sirius want to suck his bottom lip right between his teeth.
Fine, I guess.
The man repeated.
What a ringing endorsement.
Do you really want me to disparage your city?
Sirius asked.
I'm not the mayor.
The man shrugged.
I can take it.
And I'd like to give it to you, Sirius thought. The man smirked as though reading Sirius's thoughts, but said nothing, only waited expectantly.
Okay then.
Sirius agreed.
I think it's too crowded and touristy and fake. I think the ugly hag depiction of witches is borderline offensive, and I think that the people selling tarot readings and aura photos are essentially swindlers who are taking advantage of a tragedy to make money on hordes of unsuspecting fools.
Wow.
The man laughed.
Didn't mince words there, did you?
You said you could take it.
Sirius said.
Thought I did.
The man nodded slowly. His eyes lingered on Sirius for a moment longer before turning to look over his shoulder toward the dimly lit back room.
Hey, Jamie.
The man called behind him.
Yeah?
A voice replied.
Come on out here.
He said before turning back to Sirius.
What's your name, anyhow?
Sirius.
The star or the state of mind?
What do you think?
The man's eyes raked up and down Sirius's body before landing on his face again.
Someone as pretty as you? Definitely the star.
he replied, just as another man with messy jet black hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a striped polo shirt with the collar half turned up, strode into the shop from the back room.
Final score was 707-30. Mooney the Harp.
The black-haired man started to say, but stopped short when he saw Sirius and Lily. He glanced sideways at Mooney and continued speaking.
The, harpoon delivery will be here soon.
Harpoon delivery.
Lily's voice said behind them, and the black-haired man's jaw fell open, cartoon style, at the sight of her. Lily was wearing a dark green 1920s flapper-style hat with an iridescent plume of peacock feathers on one side. She walked up to Sirius and threaded her arm through his.
Harpoon is a kind of American beer.
The man called Mooney replied.
Sirius the Star, this is my best friend James.
It's nice to meet you.
James said, shaking Sirius's hand, but apparently finding it difficult to tear his eyes away from Lily.
Who's your friend?
I'm Lily.
She said briskly, turning back to Sirius.
What do you think of this hat, Padfoot? Think I can pull it off?
Sirius opened his mouth to answer, but James beat him to it.
It's beautiful. Gorgeous. The green looks incredible with your eyes and your hair.
James breathed, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. Sirius and Lily looked at each other again and tried not to laugh.
Thanks.
Lily said, pulling the hat off her head and putting it on the counter.
I guess I'll take it then.
It's on me.
James said quickly.
What? No.
Lily protested.
That's crazy.
Yeah, that's me, Crazy James Potter. That's what everyone calls me, right, Moons?
James laughed a little wildly as he started to carefully wrap the hat in tissue paper before Lily could protest again.
They will after today.
Mooney muttered under his breath.
Anyhow, Sirius says he doesn't like Salem, says it's crowded, cheesy, and touristy.
Well, that's a shame.
James replied.
Sounds like you've been going to the wrong places.
My thoughts exactly.
Mooney agreed.
But I have an excellent guidebook.
Lily protested.
How about an excellent guide instead?
Mooney asked.
What do you say? Would you like to see the real Salem?
He was answering Lily, but gazing at Sirius with that molten gold look in his eyes, and Sirius felt it warm every inch of his skin.
Well,
Sirius replied without looking away.
how could I say no to that?
Chapter 2, Killer, Thriller, Chiller.
Please let me pay for that.
Lily said, watching James wrap up her new hat.
I found $100, and I want to spend it on something frivolous.
James was busy tying ribbons to a gift bag when he dropped the pair of scissors he was holding with a clatter of metal on wood.
You found $100?
James asked, staring at Lily with a wild expression.
Yeah.
She replied and pulled a crisp bill out of her pocket.
How did you find it?
James asked, his eyes widening as they darted to the money in her hand.
Like in an old coat pocket or...
No, well, it's kind of a weird story.
Lily laughed.
A raven appeared, and then the money just dropped out of the sky, and... Hey!
Lily watched, horrified, as James dove over the counter, snatched the $100 bill out of her hand, then grabbed Remus's upper arm and hauled him back into the storeroom.
We'll be right back,
James said. Remus tripped over his feet, scrambling to follow James, while Lily whispered to Sirius that she didn't come to America to be abducted by some weirdo.
Hey, that's gonna bruise.
Remus hissed, yanking his arm out of James's grip when they were safely out of earshot in the dark storeroom, where a gnarled old house elf was busy sorting through a big box of Salem keychains next to a ghost named Martha, a sullen old woman whose farm used to be on this land. They were surrounded by boxes of touristy tchotchkes, as well as rows and rows of magical herbs, dried fungi, and potions equipment.
Master Remus, Master James.
The old elf nodded as they entered, but Martha just glared at them, as usual.
Hey, Winnie.
James muttered quickly, barely sparing a glance for the elf or ghost. He pulled out his wand, which lit of its own accord, and pointed it at the $100 bill in his hand.
Look,
James said, jabbing the bill with the lit wand tip.
Look.
Remus leaned forward and squinted, inspecting the bill, then took it and held it in front of his face.
What am I looking?
Remus said, shaking his head and raking his eyes over the paper, unsure what he was looking for. And then...
Oh.
Remus looked from the bill to James and back again. The bill's serial number was shimmering a bright, glowing gold.
Why is it...
Remus started, but James interrupted.
I cast a spell.
Remus shook his head.
Which spell?
I kind of invented it.
James admitted with a sheepish shrug.
I didn't know if it would work, so I tested a prototype on you over the summer to be sure, and
You tested it on?
yep, you. And it did work, so I decided to throw caution to the wind. Or technically to a raven, I guess.
Remus stared at James, who was fully babbling now. James was his best friend on Earth and had been since first grade when Remus sneezed a baby rabbit into existence at James's 7th birthday party. James's father had declared it the most amazing case of accidental magic he'd ever seen, and Remus happily gifted the rabbit to the birthday boy. It lived to the ripe old age of 21, which is apparently quite unusual for a rabbit, magical or otherwise. Remus strongly suspected that James giving it alcohol for its 21st birthday was a factor in its untimely demise, but had never had the heart to point this out. James and Remus had been inseparable ever since, not to mention the two most brilliant students at Ilvermorny. They were the two most brilliant people wherever they went, really, albeit in very different ways. Remus was quiet and studious, with a near photographic memory and a knack for wandless magic, while James was rambunctious and imaginative, always making up spells and creating potions like some wild-haired, eccentric inventor. James figured out that Remus was a werewolf by the time they were 8, and how to become an animagus by the time they were 14.
What, like it's hard?
He'd asked like some wizarding Elle Woods. Now, he was apparently inventing spells for the purpose of...
It's a spell to find your soulmate,
James explained.
And you tested it on me.
Remus asked.
How?
People can have more than one soulmate, you know.
James said as though this was common knowledge. Remus, on the other hand, hadn't trusted the idea of soulmates since their 9th grade divination teacher told Remus that his soulmate was a dog, which he found to be a rather low blow.
You're my platonic soulmate, so you were the perfect test subject.
James said.
I used a seagull on you, though. Remember? That day at the beach?
Yes.
Remus cried.
The seagull shit on my head, and then I found a quarter in the parking lot.
I've upgraded to a raven and a $100 bill.
James said proudly.
Seagulls have an unusually short digestive period, and not everyone would bother picking up a quarter. Ravens are more mysterious anyhow. So now, the raven appears with the money when it suspects a soulmate might be in the vicinity. Then the serial number glows if it's a match. Simple variation of the protean charm, really. Just took a bit of tinkering. Plus the addition of a bit of reverse Horcrux magic to detect the soul bond. The bird was kind of a bitch to wrangle, but...
James,
Remus said.
That's amazing magic.
I know.
And that means the girl out there
is my soulmate. I can't believe it. She's the most beautiful woman I've ever seen.
James said, then lunged at Remus, gripping his upper arms and giving him a desperate little shake.
You have to keep me from acting like an idiot.
Remus frowned at his friend. James had a certain exuberance that could sometimes be mistaken for idiocy.
I'll do my best,
Remus told him, and James collapsed heavily against him, leaning his forehead onto Remus's shoulder.
Thank you,
said James's muffled voice, but Remus pushed him off.
We have to get back out there,
Remus reminded him.
They're both waiting for us.
At that, James punched Remus hard on the shoulder.
Yeah, they are,
James said.
Sirius is hot as hell. Nice one.
Well, it's tourist season,
Remus replied with a smirking shrug.
Right, your annual slut era.
James nodded.
So we'll do the real Salem tonight then? Should we just stick to the usual? Or pull out something special for the soulmate?
Why don't we stick to the usual and see how the night goes?
Remus said, and James nodded.
Ready.
Not really,
James said. Indeed, he looked a little pale and clammy.
Come on,
Remus said, grabbing James by the arm and shoving him back toward the shop.
Good luck with your soulmate, Master James,
the elf croaked.
Thank you, Winnie,
James called over his shoulder. Remus squinted a little as his eyes adjusted from the dark. Although it was brighter than the storeroom, the shop never got any sunlight because of its weird location tucked down a literal dark alley. Maybe he should do something about that, Remus thought, thinking Sirius might like a little sunshine. He flicked a finger toward the window surreptitiously as he and James stepped out from behind the counter and into the main shop. A second later, a small shaft of sunlight was shining through the mullioned windows, casting Sirius and Lily in a pool of golden light. Sirius glanced up at the window with a wondering frown, then his eyes drifted to Remus, looking him up and down appreciatively with a little smile. Holy fuck, he is gorgeous, Remus thought, giving Sirius a once-over of his own. Sirius was, without a doubt, the most beautiful creature, man, woman, or beast, to ever wander into their shop. Remus always looked forward to tourist season in Salem, especially in October, when every fling had a built-in expiration date, and he could be part of someone's scrapbook of vacation memories.
Everything all right?
Sirius asked, looking between Remus and James, while Lily stood with her arms folded across her chest, giving them the deepest side-eye. They were still standing in front of the counter, apparently in the middle of a whispered conversation of their own.
Everything's perfect,
Remus said.
Sorry about that. James thought the bill might have been counterfeit, and he wanted to inspect it before saying anything.
And?
Lily snapped at James.
Was it?
Nope.
James chirped, handing it back to her. He let his hand linger next to Lily's for much longer than necessary, trying to get their fingers to brush together, and Remus stifled the urge to roll his eyes. But Lily just snatched the bill from James's hand and shoved it back into her pocket, apparently no longer insisting that she pay for the hat.
So if the offer still stands, we'd love for you to show us around,
Sirius said, taking a couple of steps toward Remus. They were only about 6 inches apart now. Not only did he look amazing, but Remus could swear he felt actual heat coming off of Sirius's gorgeous body. Merlin, the things he would do to him later. No mages were always blown away by sex with wizards, and especially with Remus, the wandless wonder, as James called him.
Don't call me that. It makes it sound like I don't have a dick,
Remus would say.
Don't worry, Mooney, your cock speaks for itself,
James would reply.
Of course it still stands,
Remus replied. He opened his mouth to say more, but Lily cut him off.
We are not getting into a car with you,
Lily said. Remus glanced at James, who, somehow, looked even more smitten than when he first laid eyes on Lily. James always did like getting a little roughed up, Remus thought. He personally found Lily terrifying, like an angry ginger cat. But hey, whatever flies your carpet, he supposed.
No worries, we don't even have a car,
James said, but this only made Lily narrow her eyes at them further. Nomads were always suspicious of people who didn't have cars. Why was James telling her this?
We have really great public transportation around here. Plus, we can just walk tonight,
Remus explained, but Lily didn't look mollified. Sirius put an arm around her shoulders and gave her what seemed to be a pleading look.
Lils,
He said quietly, and Lily looked up at him. They stood in silence for a few moments, and Remus watched what seemed to be a wordless conversation between them.
Fine.
Lily huffed finally, and Sirius gave her a smile and an affectionate squeeze.
Thanks, Bambi,
Sirius said quietly. Lily just grunted through pursed lips.
Walking would be great,
Sirius said, turning back to Remus.
Okay,
Remus said, ignoring Lily and addressing Sirius instead.
we need to close up here, but do you want to meet up for dinner and then hit a party after? We can walk you through some cool parts of town on the way and teach you a few things you probably didn't hear on your tours.
That sounds amazing,
Sirius said.
Great. Why don't we meet at the Bewitched statue at 7? Do you know where that is?
Yeah, our Airbnb is right around the corner,
Sirius assured him. They were just about to leave when something seemed to catch Sirius's eye. His gaze lingered just over Remus's shoulder, and Remus turned around in time to see the pearly white swish of Martha's dress flutter around the corner. Nomads couldn't see ghosts, could they? But when Remus looked back at Sirius, he didn't look surprised or frightened. On the contrary, he seemed positively thrilled at the prospect of meeting up later. He wasn't looking at the spot over Remus's shoulder at all anymore either, but at his phone. Must have been a coincidence, Remus thought. If Sirius had spotted a ghost, he definitely would have been freaked out by it. After they said their goodbyes, James and Remus quickly closed up shop, then walked upstairs to their apartment to get ready. A couple hours later, Remus had changed into his usual first weekend of the tourist season outfit. Narrowly fitting dark jeans, a gray cable-knit sweater, and black leather boots. It gave both studious man during fall in New England, and doesn't my ass look great in these jeans? James, on the other hand, emerged from his bedroom in a dress shirt and tie, and what looked to be an entire bottle of Sleeky's Tress Tamer hair potion on his head.
No,
Remus said after taking one look at him.
Be yourself, James.
She didn't like myself, I mean me.
James said. He took off his glasses and squinted into the hallway mirror, which was pointless because he couldn't see anything.
Maybe I'll try those contacts tonight.
Jamie.
Remus said, handing James the beer he'd just opened for himself. James's need was greater than his own at the moment.
Go put on your regular clothes, wash that stuff out of your hair, and put your glasses back on. You want her to fall in love with you, not your dad.
I look like my dad?
James asked, horrified. Monty Potter was a good-natured man, but not exactly the picture of youth and vitality.
A little bit,
Remus told him.
Fine.
James huffed. He waved his wand, and his hair returned to its usual untidy chaos, and shuffled back to his bedroom in defeat. A few minutes later, he re-emerged wearing a much more sensible pair of jeans, a sweatshirt, and white sneakers. Remus thought he looked really good, and if Lily couldn't tell how handsome, smart, and genuine James was, then she definitely didn't deserve him. Soulmates be damned. They stepped into the chilly October night and headed toward downtown. Unlike the tourist section of Salem, which had been a loud, non-stop party since October 1st, their street was quiet and empty, and they walked down the shadowy sidewalk under the light of the fat moon, with no one but the trees and sleepy houses for company. The moon was still 2 days away from being full, but it shone brightly and tugged at Remus's joints.
You feeling okay?
James asked, looking sideways at Remus. He could always tell when the moon started to get under Remus's skin.
Fine,
Remus assured him, pulling at the collar of his sweater and stretching his neck sideways anyhow.
just a little itchy, you know.
I do.
James said, flinging an arm over Remus's shoulder.
Might feel good to run it out in the woods this month with how busy it's been, huh?
Definitely.
Remus agreed. Salem in October was exhausting for its business owners, even Remus and James. Although their shop was located just outside the downtown limits, it still got its share of heavy tourist traffic, especially on the weekends. More and more people seemed interested in getting off the beaten track and finding places that were authentic, as though there was anything authentic about the spell kits and magical herbs they sold on the no-mage side of their shop. They did their real business as an apothecary, catering to actual witches and wizards in the area with a bustling second shop hidden within the first. It was James who thought of locating in Salem, allowing them to double dip and get both magical and non-magical customers in a single location. They arrived at the bewitched statue at 7 o'clock exactly, just as Sirius and Lily were approaching on the crowded sidewalk. James waved like the eager puppy he was, but Remus's eyes met Sirius's, and everything around them seemed to grow slow and silent. Sirius was a singular human being, Remus decided. He was a head taller than almost everyone he passed, and seemed to emanate an otherworldly, dangerous beauty, moving with a sinewy grace that stole the breath from Remus's lungs. But there was something else, too. Something about the way his eyes glittered, and his lips curved into a naughty smile that told Remus the two of them could do some damage and have some fun together.
Hey there.
Sirius said as they approached, while Lily eyed them warily.
Hi.
Remus said. This close, both to the full moon and to Sirius, Remus could smell Sirius, and he smelled incredible, like leather and musk, and oddly, the wild seaside forest where Remus sometimes spent the full moons. Suddenly, he had the strangest urge to run his fingers through Sirius's black hair. He wanted to smell him, too, now that he thought about it, to bury his face in his neck and hair and just sniff. It was so powerful that he had to actually put his hands in his pockets and take a small step backwards to keep himself from doing it.
You look stunning.
James told Lily, and she really did. She was wearing her new green hat, and it suited her perfectly, setting off her red hair and green eyes in a way that was exceptionally striking.
Thank you.
She said, then turned to Remus.
Shall we get on with it then?
Sure.
Remus replied and nodded away from downtown.
Let's head this way. Do you two like seafood?
Love it.
Sirius said, and they started to walk. He and Sirius fell into step next to each other as they wended their way down the crowded sidewalks, past shops and restaurants, where Remus and James smiled and waved at people they knew.
Thanks for doing this.
Sirius said.
I've been here for 3 days, and this is the first time I'm actually excited to do something.
I'm excited too. What kinds of things have you been doing?
Remus asked, and Sirius laughed. It was a raspy barking sound, and it made Remus's skin prickle pleasantly. He looked sideways at Sirius, admiring the way he moved. It was elegant, yet full of energy, as though he had something powerful and bounding lingering underneath his skin, ready to burst free.
Well, I should preface this by saying that Lily has been in charge of the itinerary.
Sirius said,
But so far we've had several psychic readings, 3 ghost tours, an aura photo session that went slightly awry, a tarot lesson, a Samhain circle, and a broomstick making class.
Sounds dreadful.
Remus agreed and Sirius laughed again.
But you're looking forward to tonight?
I am.
Sirius said,
And not just because of your promise to show us the real Salem, whatever that means. I was happy to have a chance to spend some time with you.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Sirius said, and Remus's stomach swooped pleasantly at the sight of the sweet little smile that crossed his face.
So where in England are you from?
Remus asked.
London.
Sirius answered.
Islington, specifically. I don't know how well you know the city.
I've never been.
Remus admitted. It was hard for werewolves to travel to the UK, but he couldn't exactly tell Sirius that. The British laws and accommodations for people with lycanthropy were positively backwards compared to the United States, not to mention the prejudice.
You're not missing anything.
Sirius said,
I'm sick as hell of it, to be honest. My family is a nightmare, my job is boring, and I'm tired of seeing the same fucking people everywhere I go. I swear, everyone is at least half related to me in some way.
Sounds awful.
Remus said.
Half related? Who do you date?
Sirius started but stopped himself.
Mundane people.
Ugh.
Remus replied. He could relate.
So what do you do for work?
I work for the government.
How delightfully vague.
Remus said, and Sirius laughed.
Trust me, it's boring. I'll spare you the grim details. Suffice it to say, it started out interesting, but now it's mostly pushing paper while sitting behind a desk, and I hate it.
I had a job like that.
Remus said, remembering his first few years after graduating from Ilvermorny. He'd worked for the Department of Werewolf Children and Families, helping parents of recently bitten children access community resources and services.
I thought it was noble work at first, and I thought that I was the perfect person to do it. I was helping people, kids, who really needed it.
Remus said.
But I got burned out really, really fast. There was so much red tape and bureaucracy, and it seemed like everything I wanted to do, I couldn't. By the time I left to start the shop with James, I wondered if I'd really done any good at all.
Sirius turned to look at him with an amazed look on his face.
I feel exactly the same way,
he said.
I'm in a branch of law enforcement, and like you said, at first, I thought I could really make a difference, fighting dark. Bad guys, I mean. But it's not really like that at all. It's more ass-kissing and greasing palms. It seems like everyone is either corrupt or corruptible. And don't even get me started on the paperwork.
Sounds like you need a change.
You know what? I really fucking do.
Sirius agreed.
What's Salem like to live in?
Sirius laughed, and so did Remus, but he also experienced something very odd. He felt dizzy and lightheaded as the vision of a huge black dog laying across his chest the morning after the full moon swam into his mind. It was so startlingly real, he could almost feel the dog's soft fur and heavy weight on top of him.
Do you have any pets?
He asked suddenly, and Sirius looked at him.
No,
he said with an odd little laugh.
Do you?
So?
Remus replied, feeling a little disappointed, and kept walking. They turned down a few side streets, and the crowds thinned as they entered a neighborhood filled with historic buildings from the Federal period. Remus pointed out houses that once belonged to sea captains and merchants who got rich trading with the Far East during the 1700s, telling them stories of marauding pirates and battles at sea before turning into another, even less touristy neighborhood.
Now this,
Remus said, pointing to a small monument,
is where people think Gallows Hill was, the place where they hanged the witches during the witch trials, but it's actually here.
He pointed across the street to another, smaller hill, and nearly yelped with what he saw. There in the front yard was the ghost of a man hanging from a tree branch with a noose tied around his neck. His face was bloated and grotesque, with unseeing, bulging eyes. His tongue lolled from his open mouth, and he swung ghoulishly from the rope as though in a heavy breeze, with buckled shoes hanging limply off his feet.
Oh!
Lily cried, and Sirius and Remus wheeled around. She had stumbled and was now staring wide-eyed at the house with the tree in its front yard.
I just tripped on a cobblestone,
she said quickly, straightening up and looking around at James, Sirius, and Remus.
No need to get your knickers in a twist.
James grasped her arm to help her, but she pulled away. The ghost's eyes snapped open, and he laughed.
Gotcha, you land of the living motherfuckers.
He called in a rough voice.
Have a cursed All Hallows Eve.
Remus sneakily gave the ghost the finger, and they kept walking. They went to dinner at a small, no-name restaurant at the rocky edge of Salem Harbor, where dayboat fishermen out of Marblehead brought in what they didn't sell at the docks. The result was a menu that was never set and relied on the creativity of the chef to devise different dishes every day with whatever seasonal trash fish they brought in. The place was tiny, more like a fishing shack, really, and had walls lined with old buoys and tide charts that were charmed to change with the moon phases, weather, seasons, and high and low tides, although Remus froze them the moment they walked in with a flick of his finger. The owners also let James hop behind the bar sometimes to flex his potion-making prowess, so he mixed them a cocktail he called the Spellbound, which contained bourbon, ginger, and another secret ingredient that Remus knew was butterbeer.
Wow, this is amazing.
Sirius said, taking a sip.
It tastes like, something we have at home.
He glanced at Lily across the table, who gave him a small, secret-seeming smile over the rim of her glass.
It does.
Lily agreed.
It's delicious, thank you.
She smiled at James, who nearly fell off his chair with happiness. Remus noticed her starting to thaw toward him a little during dinner. Maybe it was because she was having fun, but more likely it was because they hadn't been victims of a homicide yet. Either way, he was thrilled for James.
So where's this party?
Sirius asked.
It's in this cool little speakeasy kind of street just outside downtown.
Remus said.
The whole street is a speakeasy.
Lily asked.
Yeah, it's kind of, just for locals, to get away from the Halloween crowds.
Wow.
Lily said.
That's weird.
Not really.
James said.
There must be places in England like that, that only the locals know about.
Sirius and Lily glanced at each other again, and Remus thought he saw another meaningful look pass between them.
Yeah, there are a few places like that I can think of.
Sirius agreed. They walked back toward downtown after dinner, then turned down a narrow, brick-lined alleyway where a heavy metal door was propped open with a cinder block. The door opened to a dark hallway where a single, naked light bulb hanging from a chain flickered at the far end of the passage. Remus and James started to walk inside, but Lily's voice stopped them.
We're going in there.
She asked, but Sirius answered her.
Don't worry, Lils,
he said. She looked at him, and he patted his chest twice with the tips of his fingers. Her eyes flicked down to his hand and back up to his face, and she nodded. Still, she slipped her hand into his before following James and Remus into the dark hallway. The hall got brighter, then darker, then brighter again as they walked through its twists and turns, before ending at a brick wall with nothing but a purple neon sign reading "Cookies This Way," hanging crookedly at one corner. Remus whispered the password. Spectral evidence, the brick wall swung forward, and Remus was satisfied to hear Lily gasp behind them. They stepped into what could only be described as a riotous street party, filled with witches, wizards, and all manner of odd creatures dancing, drinking, and laughing. Strings of fairy lights crisscrossed over their heads, hung between the brick buildings and winding around fire escapes. A band played rollicking swing music from a rooftop, and trumpets and snare drums blared as they walked past street performers swallowing fire, dancers spinning with glittering scarves, bartenders mixing smoking, bubbling cocktails from street carts, and artists creating ice sculptures of dragons that breathed fire. Sirius and Lily's heads swiveled around in awe, and Remus watched them happily. He'd never get tired of taking no madges here. The only time he could get away with it was in October, when all of Salem looked like some kind of version of this, albeit less fun and far less magical. No madges just assumed that everyone was in very elaborate costumes. But what they didn't know was that the fairy lights over their heads were strung with real fairies, that the dragon ice sculpture was breathing real fire and was charmed not to melt, that the bartender's cocktails were actually potent potions designed to fuck you up in ways no mages could never dream of, that the hags who roamed the streets lived in the forest in real huts made of bones. Not that Remus liked that too much. He'd come across his share of grumpy hags on mornings after the full moon. They'd chase him away from their huts, brandishing a thigh bone over their heads like a billy club and spitting at him to spread their curses.
This looks really, authentic.
Sirius said, leaning close to Remus so he could hear him over the trumpets.
Doesn't it?
Remus agreed, but Sirius was walking away from him, toward a street cart selling barrels full of potion ingredients like lacewing fly and Abraxan hair.
Lily, look at this.
He called, holding up a heavy, silvery Akame egg. Her eyes widened, and they stared at each other for a moment before the cart's owner started telling them off.
Hands off the merchandise!
She snapped, snatching the egg out of Sirius's hand.
Is that?
Lily asked, leaning over the cart.
Unicorn hair?
The merchant finished for her.
10 biggins a bundle.
10 biggins.
Lily asked, and Remus wondered at the tone of her voice. She emphasized the word 10 rather than the word biggins, as though she was more surprised by the price than she was by hearing the odd word for their magical currency for the first time.
That's a fair price,
the merchant said, but Sirius was already dragging Lily away.
Want to check out the Sphinx's riddle?
James asked, turning to Remus.
I heard there's a DJ on their rooftop bar tonight. Maybe they'll play Thriller and do that zombie flash mob again.
Yeah, all right.
Remus said. He turned to Sirius and Lily.
Sound good?
Sounds great.
Sirius agreed, and they set off.
Remus, James, didn't expect to see you this early in the season.
A woman was sitting on a stool at the bar door, reading in between checking IDs and stamping hands. She put her book down as they approached and gave them a bright, sharp smile. She had incredibly pale skin, almost purely white, blood-red lips, and long jet-black hair that fell down to the ample curve of her ass. She hopped off her stool and slinked over to Remus, her tight, low-cut dress leaving very little to the imagination, then placed her palm flat against his chest before wrapping it around his waist, sliding it up under his sweater as she did.
The dark-haired one yours?
She whispered in his ear, looking Sirius up and down hungrily. Remus glanced over his shoulder at Sirius, who was watching them with his eyes narrowed.
Hopefully.
Remus answered her, and he felt her sharp, pointed eye tooth scrape against his neck. She was dangerously close to drawing blood, right there in the street, the fucking exhibitionist, and Remus squirmed out of her grasp.
Call me if you want a third,
she said, wiping the corner of her mouth.
He looks delicious.
I'm not sharing this one, Viv.
Remus told her, taking a step back. He paid the cover charge for all 4 of them, and she retreated back to her book. A Court of Wings in Ruin, Remus saw, and he couldn't help but laugh. Yep, that tracked, he thought.
Have fun with your sweet, innocent little pixie, Jamie.
Viv called after them as they climbed upstairs.
Thank you.
James answered at the same time Remus said.
Fuck you, Viv.
Anytime you want to, Mooney.
She called back.
She seems friendly.
Sirius said, looking over his shoulder at Viv, who was now wrapping her slender arms around a beautiful witch wearing nothing but head-to-toe chainmail.
She has her moments.
Remus agreed.
Kind of a biting personality, though.
Sirius snorted a laugh at that, and Remus looked at him wonderingly, but shook it off. Viv was dressed like a vampire, after all. They walked onto the open-air rooftop patio, and James and Lily made a beeline to the bar. Together. Lily was laughing and touching James's arm as they waited to order drinks, and James caught Remus's eye. Remus raised his eyebrows, and James gave him 2 excited thumbs up as Lily turned to talk to the bartender. Who knew that Lily would finally relax on a wizarding street? The sky above their heads was dark and almost completely black, the stars all but snuffed out by the lights of the city. But the moon was fat and bright, casting an otherworldly silvery light across Sirius's face. It was so beautiful that Remus almost didn't mind the way the moon pulled at his body and buzzed around his bones. Only a few things soothed that antsy, itchy feeling in the days before the full moon. Weed, loud music, dancing, sweaty sex. Things that pulled Remus out of his body and sent him floating into the atmosphere instead.
Want to dance?
Sirius asked, as though he could read Remus's thoughts. He reached out a hand, and Remus took it. It was warm and strong and curved around his, with a surety that Remus wasn't used to. He was always the one taking the lead, but he thought he'd really enjoy ceding control to Sirius for a while. The DJ was playing something slow and sultry now, and they folded their bodies into each other on the dance floor, slotting together effortlessly. Sirius's chest was firm and felt so good pressed against his own, and Remus pulled him closer, wrapping one arm around his lower back and another around his neck. Heat coiled and pooled in his stomach as they moved together. He tipped his head so his chin was resting on Sirius's shoulder, his face brushing against Sirius's hair, and once again Sirius's intoxicating scent threatened to overwhelm him. He breathed him in deeply, and he tried hard not to be weird about it, but Remus couldn't help it. He felt lightheaded and giddy, like he wanted to climb Sirius, lick him, rub his face all over him. It was a sensation that he was vaguely aware of feeling before, but he couldn't quite place it. Then it struck him. He'd felt it as the wolf, in that deep, primal canine desire to mark and claim, and he felt it now, pulling at him and filling him with desire. He needed to calm down. He didn't want to do something wolfy he'd regret, like hump Sirius's leg while biting the scruff of his neck or something, and the only way to do that was to put some distance between the two of them. He tried to step back, but Sirius only tightened his grip and looked at him with a dark heat in his eyes that told Remus that he wasn't the only one feeling something strange there under the almost full moon. Chapter 3. Oh Fantasy Free Me. Earlier that afternoon,
So, they're wizards.
Sirius said as they rounded the corner away from Quoth the Raven. Lily looked up at him with an incredulous expression, pausing in her struggle to pull the price tag off her new hat.
Who? Tweedledee and Tweedledum back there?
She asked, jerking her head back toward Remus and James's shop.
What makes you say that?
I just watched Remus do magic for the last 15 minutes. He transfigured a pen into a mouse while you were trying on hats.
Sirius said. Lily looked unconvinced.
I thought real magic wasn't allowed in downtown Salem.
Lily said, but Sirius shook his head.
I don't think we're technically downtown anymore,
he replied, gesturing around them. Indeed, they were surrounded by houses on a quiet street far from the main drag.
Maybe.
Lily conceded, but she sounded skeptical.
It's so hard to tell with Americans. Their accents make them sound like bloody morons.
I liked Remus's accent,
Sirius said, and Lily snorted.
Yeah, that's not all you liked about him,
she said.
I saw the way you were looking at him. I could practically read your thoughts. They were fucking obscene, by the way.
I couldn't help it.
Sirius moaned.
He's fit as hell and so damn charming. This trip just got a lot better, and he's a wizard on top of it. It's like I placed an order for the perfect man. Hot, smart, magical, and not related to me.
Lily shook her head.
Except we don't actually know that he's a wizard, do we?
Lily said.
Perhaps he was just doing muggle magic like David Blaine.
Okay, first of all, that Blaine bloke is no fucking muggle.
Sirius said.
And second, do you think I can't tell when someone's using real magic right in front of my face?
Well, I guess if anyone could tell, it would be you.
Lily conceded. And she was right. Sirius wasn't just a wizard. He was an animagus auror and a black for Merlin's sake. He could tell the difference between real magic and sleight of hand with his eyes closed. Plus, he could smell Remus's magic in the air once he realized what he was smelling. Not every witch or wizard's magic emitted a scent, of course, only the most powerful ones, and most people couldn't smell it anyhow. But Sirius Black wasn't most people. Neither apparently was Remus, whose scent was not only strong, but fucking intoxicating. What made things even odder was that Sirius didn't just smell it while Remus was casting spells, like he did with everyone else. It lingered around him all the time, and it was incredible, delicious. Sirius wanted to bathe in it, dip strawberries in it, and lick it off his fingers, but he wouldn't mention that part to Lily.
I watched him with my own eyes, Lils, and I smelled every spell he cast.
Sirius said.
Oh, and by the way, he did it all without a wand.
Wow, impressive.
And I'm pretty sure there was something weird about that $100 bill, too.
Do you think that's why James was freaking out about it?
Lily asked, and reached into her pocket for the money. She held it in front of her face, inspecting it for a few seconds before letting out a little squeak of surprise and stopping in her tracks on the sidewalk.
Merlin's balls, you're right, look at that,
she said. And sure enough, the serial numbers on the bill were glowing gold.
Well, I'll be damned.
Sirius breathed.
What do you think it is?
Can't be sure, but maybe some kind of protean charm.
Sirius said. He took the bill from Lily, and the numbers suddenly glowed even brighter under his touch.
But that would mean it needs to be activated by something too.
Are they fucking with us?
Lily asked, a little hint of humored outrage spiking her voice.
Did they really think we wouldn't notice all this?
I don't know,
Sirius said, turning the bill over in his hands. It felt oddly warm, as though he could feel the glowing numbers in his fingers.
but I think we should find out.
Prank?
Lily asked, her eyes sparkling with that familiar glow of mischief.
Prank.
Sirius agreed. Phase 1 of their prank was playing along with the Muggle act for as long as they could. They dutifully ignored the ghosts that popped out at them all over the city. They didn't let on that they recognized the taste of butterbeer in the cocktail James made. They played dumb during the street carnival, looking around in wide-eyed wonder and even brazenly grabbing an Akame egg off a cart, as though it wasn't wildly rare and expensive. Sirius almost lost his cool with the vampire. Remus's joke about her biting personality caught him a bit off guard, but he shook that off too. It also didn't take him long to realize that Remus and James probably took Muggles out on the magical town all the time. What better way to impress a date and get in their knickers? Sirius had to hand it to them. It certainly was a ballsy tactic, and they must have a pretty decent success rate. But Sirius would have let Remus in his knickers even without the magical field trip. He was fun, funny, and dead clever, not to mention devastatingly handsome, and he smelled amazing. Distractingly so, and even better than he had in the shop. It was sort of strange, actually, and getting worse all night. At one point during dinner, Remus leaned in front of him to pick something up off the floor, and he smelled so good and looked so gorgeous. Sirius had to hold himself back from licking the side of his neck. And even beyond all that, Remus and James were genuinely good blokes, and Sirius could see them all becoming real friends. It was almost a shame they had to fuck with them so hard first. But that was all right, Sirius reasoned. He'd come clean to Remus eventually and make it all up to him with some spectacular farewell shagging for his troubles. Sirius was supremely confident in himself and their plan. That is, until he and Remus started to dance. The moment they touched, everything changed. Suddenly, Remus's scent became irresistible. It not only smelled like hot, glowing magic, but also like the forbidden forest on a cool, crisp fall night, like chocolate and Earl Grey tea, and something else, something sweet, floral, and so deeply familiar he could feel it in his bones. It was soothing and comforting, but also wildly erotic, and Sirius found himself pressing his body closer. He couldn't get close enough. Remus felt so good against him, with his firm chest and strong arms, and before Sirius realized it, he was tipping his face toward Remus's neck and breathing deeply, running his hands up and down his back. Sirius could feel Remus's heart pounding throughout his own body, like a strange life energy surging between them, and out of nowhere, he thought inexplicably of Padfoot, running through the forest under the light of a silvery full moon. And he wanted Remus there with him. Suddenly, Remus backed away, looking slightly dazed, but Sirius didn't want to let him go. Instead, Sirius pulled him closer. Their eyes met, and the air seemed to crackle between them. Sirius felt as though there was a powerful magnet beneath his ribcage, drawing him closer and closer to Remus. He was sure Remus felt it too. It was as though the universe was asking a question, and the answer was right in front of them, as bright and clear as the almost full moon shining over their heads. Remus raised his hand slowly, his fingers brushing against Sirius's jaw, and it was over. Sirius's chin tipped upwards, his eyes fell shut, and he leaned forward, closer and closer, so close that he could nearly taste Remus's magic on his tongue. He parted his lips and...
Sirius!
Lily was next to him in a flash, clamping her hand around his wrist and yanking him away. Sirius stumbled sideways, glancing over his shoulder in time to see Remus staring after him with his mouth hanging open. He looked slightly stunned. Sirius felt a little foggy himself, but allowed Lily to pull him to the far corner of the rooftop bar overlooking Salem Harbor, which sparkled darkly under the bright, round moon.
We need to get out of here,
Lily whispered. She, too, looked quite out of sorts, with flushed pink cheeks, glassy eyes, and her witch hat headband askew.
What's wrong?
Sirius asked, swiftly snapping out of his strange trance.
I want to lick James,
she said breathlessly.
I want to unwrap him like a human lollipop and suck him dry.
Oh, wow, okay.
Sirius nodded, looking over Lily's shoulder at James and Remus, who were engaged in an equally frantic conversation in the middle of the dance floor. As though on cue, They both looked over at Sirius and Lily and quickly looked away.
Fuck me, he's gorgeous.
Lily said in a tortured voice.
What happened? You were calling him Tweedledum not 4 hours ago.
I don't know. Everything was fine while we were chatting by the bar. I was even starting to think all his golden retriever energy was kind of cute, but then he asked me to dance. And I don't know what happened. His hands, his eyes, and his body. I touched his arm. He definitely played Quidditch. Merlin's balls, Sirius, the things he could do with those thighs. All night long, I bet.
Lily was breathless now, working herself into a horny froth.
All right, I get the picture,
Sirius said. Lily shook her head a little, then stared at James in a kind of lusty panic.
What's happening?
Lily demanded.
Why do I want to lick him?
I don't know, but I'm having a similar problem,
Sirius told her.
With Remus?
Lily said, her eyes wide.
No, Lily, with the hag outside. Yes, with Remus.
Sirius dropped his voice and leaned closer.
I would also like to do some licking.
Do you think they dosed us with something? Amotentia, maybe? They could have put it in the butterbeer cocktail.
No,
Sirius said, shaking his head.
We would have smelled it. You can't hide the scent of amortentia behind anything. And besides, I would have tasted it too. Powdered moonstone has a really distinctive flavour. It's Aura Training 101.
What about a different potion or a spell?
But Sirius shook his head.
I don't think so,
he said.
Well, what the hell is going on then?
I don't know,
Sirius said.
But maybe it's nothing sinister. Maybe we both just want to get railed by a couple of good-looking American boys.
You know it's more than that,
Lily insisted. She gave him an appraising once-over before reaching up to smooth out his hair.
Merlin, Sirius, you look absolutely feral right now.
You don't look so tame yourself, Bambi,
Sirius told her.
I haven't seen you with that expression since the morning after you almost let that stag mount you in the forest.
It was a royal stag, Pads, 12 points.
I said it then, and I'll say it now. You're not actually a doe, Lily.
Yes, but the stag didn't know that.
They silently glared at each other for a long moment. Then they both burst out laughing, doubling over and gripping each other's arms to keep themselves upright. They were so loud that people turned to stare at them, including James and Remus.
Hush!
Lily hissed, trying to quell her laughter.
We need to keep it together.
Right.
Sirius nodded.
Right. Okay. It seems to be worse when we touch them, so let's just not do that, all right?
Yes, all right.
For now.
Sirius amended.
For now.
Lily agreed.
No licking, mounting, or sucking until our task is complete, deal?
Deal.
It wasn't easy, but Sirius and Lily persevered. The next evening, Remus and James took Sirius and Lily to a Halloween haunted house on the wooded outskirts of town. Sirius was expecting another wizarding spot, maybe one with real ghosts and poltergeists, but he was rather charmed to discover that it was actually a muggle attraction, complete with plastic skeletons, great fake hairy spiders, and people dressed as zombies and chainsaw murderers jumping out at them from around corners. He'd worn a long trench coat to hide his wand in his pocket, and gleefully pointed out all of the amazing parts of the haunted house as they moved through it.
Wow, those bats look like they're really flying. They're so lifelike.
Sirius cried after casting a silent hovering charm over a flock of plastic bats and sending them swooping down over Remus and James's heads. They ducked and yelped, trying to wave them away, but the bats were relentless. One even landed right on Remus's shoulder and stayed there for a solid 2 minutes while he tried to shake it off. They turned down a creepy hallway lined with bracketed torches and spooky paintings whose eyes moved as they walked, but James and Remus found their path temporarily blocked by an invisible barrier. They ran their hands over it, feeling around for a way through, but couldn't find one.
You guys are so funny,
Lily said as she and Sirius turned around.
I usually think mimes are annoying, but you two make it look sort of cute.
James and Remus exchanged a silent, worried look, then gave one more mighty push against the invisible barrier. It suddenly fell away, and they stumbled forward. James fell to his knees at Lily's feet, appropriate, Sirius thought, but Sirius caught Remus, wrapping his arms around his waist and hoisting him up. Like the night before, the moment they touched, Sirius felt wild, reckless desire surge through his body, and he was nearly overcome by the urge to shove Remus against one of the creepy paintings and snog him senseless. but Lily must have sensed something amiss because she stepped between them, shooting Sirius a significant look with a minute shake of her head. They carried on, encountering tap-dancing skeletons, a barbershop quartet of styrofoam ghosts, and a haunted porcelain doll that recited dirty limericks. Remus and James looked satisfyingly confused and frightened.
I had no idea American haunted houses were so interactive,
Sirius said to Remus, who answered him with a tight smile.
Yeah, me either,
He said weakly. In an ancient Egyptian-themed room, Lily waved the wand hidden in her handbag. A dusty sarcophagus creaked open, and an ancient bandaged mummy lurched toward James with its arms outstretched, closing its skeletal vice-like hands around his wrists and pulling him back toward the tomb with relentless strength and determination, ignoring James's increasingly frantic protests. Finally, Remus pried the mummy's fingers off of James and shoved the creature to the floor.
What's wrong with you, dude?
James yelled at the mummy, who didn't reply. In fact, it didn't move at all. It was stiff, like a mannequin. James bent over for a closer look, then turned toward Remus with an ashen pall across his face.
It's plastic,
he said, and Remus's eyes widened.
This haunted house is amazing,
Lily said cheerily. Remus and James emerged from the haunted house looking decidedly worse for wear, but Lily and Sirius walked with a jaunty spring in their steps.
Can I buy you a cup of hot cider?
Sirius asked Remus as they approached a little outdoor stall on the lawn outside. Remus silently nodded, casting a nervous, wary glance back toward the haunted house.
4 ciders, please?
Sirius asked the girl at the booth. She filled 4 paper cups, and Sirius handed one to Remus, who took it with a quiet thank you. Sirius turned away, then waved the wand in his pocket.
What the hell?
Remus's voice said, and Sirius had to suppress a wicked smile. Sirius asked, looking over his shoulder at Remus again.
Where did it go?
Remus demanded.
Where did what go?
The cider, I just had it. You just handed it to me.
Indeed, Remus's empty hand was curled as though around an invisible cup. Sirius gave him a confused and pitying look.
I haven't given it to you yet,
Sirius said, shaking his head. He lifted the cup in his hand.
It's right here, see?
But you...
Remus sputtered.
I was waiting for whipped cream.
Sirius shrugged.
But if you're that thirsty now, I guess.
James,
Remus said out of nowhere.
I forgot something in the house. Will you come with me to get it, please?
But James didn't answer. He was staring at a small dollop of whipped cream, smeared across Lily's upper lip with a dopey, reverent longing.
Prongs.
Right, sorry.
They hurried away, and Lily and Sirius started batting at each other with their hands, emitting silent screams of delight.
Should we feel guilty?
Sirius asked.
No,
Lily said.
this is so fun, but you better be more careful. I saw you almost shove Remus against the wall and start snogging him back there.
You should talk,
Sirius said.
James put his arm around you while we were queuing for tickets, and I thought you were going to drop your panties right in front of a family of 4.
Lily looked over her shoulder to make sure James and Remus were still out of sight.
I think I've got it bad, Sirius.
She admitted.
I really like him. He's so funny and really sweet. He's like the most genuine person I've ever met.
Except for that teeny business about tricking you into thinking he's a muggle.
Well, yeah, but to be fair, we're doing the same thing.
True. They started it, though.
Sirius said, and Lily rolled her eyes.
You can't tell me that you don't feel the same way about Remus.
She said. She was right, of course, but it was hard to explain. The thing was, Sirius felt much more than physical attraction toward him. There was something else, something more that he couldn't describe. It felt like an electric, magnetic, physical force, pulling them together so strongly that it was impossible to resist or ignore. He wondered if Remus felt it too. He had to. The next day, the 4 of them met for lunch in downtown Salem. James told them that their shop was closed that day and the next, which was odd, considering it was the middle of the week during Salem's busiest time of year. But Lily and Sirius didn't question it. Instead, they ordered beers, which Remus refused with a weak shake of his head. Remus barely touched his pizza, either, even though he'd said earlier that he was hungry. In fact, Remus was unusually quiet and pale, and James kept leaning close to him and whispering, sometimes putting a comforting hand on his back and rubbing in slow circles. James even ordered a drink for him when Remus got up to use the loo.
Could my friend get another glass of water, please?
James asked the waiter, his eyes darting to the bathroom door every few seconds until Remus emerged. James raised his eyebrows, and a silent conversation seemed to pass between them as Remus walked back to their table. Remus nodded at James as he sat back down. Remus took a sip of water, squeezed his eyes shut as he swallowed, and James signaled for the check.
Are you all right?
Lily asked Remus.
Yeah, just, didn't sleep great last night.
Remus replied, even though there was clearly more to it than mere tiredness. Remus looked awful, even worse than when they'd first sat down. But Remus wasn't the only person at that table feeling under the weather. Sirius watched Remus with an odd, sick sensation churning around his heart and stomach. And mixed in with all that, Sirius was possessed by the strangest urge to wrap Remus in a blanket, scoop him up, and carry him home, shoving aside anyone who tried to get in his way. He even felt oddly territorial whenever James touched him, grinding his teeth and drumming his fingers against the table in agitation. Lily elbowed Sirius hard in the ribs whenever she caught him glaring at James from across the table.
Knock it off. What's wrong with you?
She whispered.
I don't know.
Sirius replied, trying to reshape his face into a normal expression and ignore the dizzying nausea that threatened to overwhelm him.
Lunch is my treat.
James said, quietly pulling out his wallet and handing his credit card to the waiter.
Thank you. Let us take you out tonight.
Lily told him, but James shook his head.
Can't tonight.
He replied curtly, then softened at the surprised look on Lily's face.
Sorry, we've got plans. Maybe tomorrow? You guys aren't leaving until Saturday, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Lily said, giving Sirius a wondering look, but Sirius just grimaced through his sticky, aching discomfort. They walked silently outside into the cool October sunlight and onto the busy, brick-lined sidewalk. It was only 3:30 in the afternoon, but already Sirius could sense the coming evening as the sun dipped low and golden in the bright New England sky. Remus turned to him with an expression that was impossibly tired and weary, but also soft and sweet. Sirius wanted to melt.
Sorry we have to cut the day short,
he said in a ragged voice. He looked as though he could barely keep his eyes open, and Sirius couldn't ignore the feeling in his body any longer. He took Remus by the hand and folded him into his arms. Immediately, the sick feeling in his chest evaporated. Remus melted into him instantly, too, resting nearly his full body weight against Sirius's chest and tipping his cheek onto Sirius's shoulder.
Take care of yourself, all right, darling?
Sirius whispered, barely wondering about the term of endearment, and he felt Remus nod quietly against him. They breathed into each other for several long moments until finally Remus lifted his head. They gazed into the other's eyes for the span of a heartbeat, and Sirius wanted nothing more than to close the space between them, take Remus's face in his hands, and kiss him. But he didn't. Instead, he ran his thumb softly across Remus's cheek and gave him a small smile. Remus returned it with a weak, tired smile of his own before allowing James to steer him away.
Good night,
Remus whispered before they turned and walked off down the street, looking behind him at Sirius one more time before they disappeared into the crowd. Sirius just stood there, watching him go with an ache in his chest that felt as though he'd had a rib removed.
That was strange.
Lily said quietly.
I hope he's all right.
Yeah.
Sirius replied, staring down the sidewalk at the space where Remus had been.
Me too.
But Sirius couldn't shake the feeling that Remus wasn't all right. He was distracted the whole rest of the afternoon, pacing around their Airbnb while Lily got ready for dinner. He felt itchy and antsy, as though his skin was suddenly the wrong shape for his body. It was nearly sunset when Sirius decided he couldn't take it anymore.
I can't do this, Lily,
he said.
I need to know.
Need to know what?
I need to know what's wrong with Remus.
Lily shook her head.
You'll just have to wait until morning, mate.
She said.
James told us they had plans tonight.
He's lying.
Sirius insisted.
Remus is sick. There's no way he's going out like that.
What do you want to do then?
Lily asked.
I want to take care of him.
Sirius, you've known him for 2 days.
I don't care. You know there's something strange going on between us. All of us.
Sirius said, giving Lily a desperate, pleading look.
At least let me bring him dinner.
So that's what they did. Sirius bought soup, bread, and a bouquet of flowers from the market before he and Lily walked away from downtown toward Quoth the Raven, where James and Remus lived upstairs. When they arrived, the shop was locked as expected, with the sign on the door flipped to closed. But it wasn't empty. Instead, a fire was blazing in the hearth, and two figures, one standing upright, the other slumped sideways and being supported by an arm, stood silhouetted against the flames. Sirius's heart lurched. He recognized the outline of Remus's curved shoulders leaning heavily against James. But before he could do anything, the fire whooshed a flashing emerald green, and James's voice cried,
"The Thestral's nest."
And they disappeared.
He's sick,
Sirius said, wheeling around toward Lily.
I knew it, he's sick. Where the hell are they going?
I don't know, but I think we need to mind our own business, Sirius.
Lily replied. Sirius was already shaking his head, though. His body felt like it was going to implode. He wanted to rip his skin off.
No,
Sirius said, and before Lily could protest, he grabbed her by the hand, said,
the Thestral's nest,
and apparated them away. Brisk, salty sea air kissed Sirius's skin as they landed with a thud in a dark, overgrown parking lot behind a derelict, gray, clapboard-sided building that must have once been a pub, although it looked long abandoned. It was surrounded by thick woods that were incredibly dark and impenetrable, despite the light of the full moon overhead. They looked around for half a second before seeing a green burst of light inside the broken-down building. A moment later, two dark figures emerged from the back door. They stood at the edge of the woods for a moment before apparating away, and Sirius followed without hesitation, thinking only,
Remus.
He and Lily landed deep in the woods, and it took several long moments before his eyes adjusted enough to get their bearings. He could hear the wind in the trees overhead, and in the distance, waves crashing against rock.
Where do you think we are?
Lily asked, still gripping tightly to Sirius's hand. He was just about to pull his wand from his pocket when a bright white light shone in their faces.
What the hell are you doing?
James's angry voice yelled. He crashed toward them through the trees, ignoring the thickets and brambles as he ran.
Get out now, you're not safe here. James, it's all right.
Sirius said,
We're wizards too.
Yeah, no shit.
James snapped and jabbed his wand through the air at Sirius.
You've got to get out of here before the wards close.
I'm worried about Remus.
Sirius protested.
I know something is wrong. Where is he?
You should be worried about yourselves. You're about 30 seconds from meeting a fully grown fucking werewolf.
James said, trembling panic bleeding from every single word.
I'm begging you, Sirius, take Lily and leave now.
But what about you?
Lily said, dropping Sirius's hand and rushing toward James.
Come with us.
I'm fine.
James cried.
Please just...
But what James was about to say next died in his throat as he turned to look over his shoulder. The air around them whooshed through the trees, rustling the branches and swirling the dead, dried leaves around their feet. The wind moved around the forest in a series of crisp clicks, like locks sliding shut, and Sirius knew they were trapped. He and Lily stared at each other for a silent breath when a blood-curdling scream of pure agony rent the air. It ripped through Sirius's body like a ragged blade, and he felt a searing pain in his heart as the tortured human scream suddenly deepened into a ghastly, barking, beastly howl.
What do we do?
Lily asked, her words trembling and her face ghostly white in the light of James's wand. James's head whipped around at the sound of Lily's voice, and he swallowed hard before answering.
Run!
Chapter 4, Hairy-Handed Gent.
Run,
James said again, breathless and pale. But Lily didn't run. Instead, she squared her shoulders and balled her fists.
No.
She said, her words flinty and defiant.
Not without you.
Sirius heard her voice, heard James give an answer, but didn't register what they were saying. The wolf's anguished cry drowned out all sound, tearing Sirius to pieces, splitting his heart. Not his heart. His soul. He felt it ripping, being shredded and mauled as though by invisible claws. He stumbled forward with his arms outstretched, his palms scraping against the rough trunk of a towering pine tree, fighting for each wounded breath, and the world seemed to shrink into only that which was primal and ancient. The wolf's terrible, lonely cry under the full moon, the briny mineral scents of ocean and earth, the spongy decay and regrowth of the forest floor, and the shining, glowing moon pulling at the tides at their bones. Moss and bark, dirt and sap, heaving breath and surging blood. And then Lily's hands were on Sirius's shoulders, shaking him awake. her voice screaming in his face.
Padfoot! Change into Padfoot!
Lily's green eyes were wide and panicked as they stared into his. Then they darted over his shoulder and widened further as she screamed, the shrill sound piercing his eardrums like a lance. Sirius wheeled around in time to see bright, glowing yellow eyes and bared, gnashing teeth bounding toward them, heedless of time and distance, crashing through the trees, preparing to pounce.
Now, Lily, now!
James's voice cried out behind him, and in an instant, Sirius's world shifted, his senses heightening and dulling all at once. Scents and sounds magnified, colors muted, and the atmosphere brightened into a dim gray through the dog's eyes. Normally, Padfoot would have been able to pick out the scents and vibrations of individual animals around him in the forest. But not tonight. Instead, he was only aware of the overwhelming sensation of the wolf charging toward him, shaking the ground, his snarling breath heavy, his heady musk powerful, magnetic, alluring, and belonging to him. On instinct, Padfoot crouched and dropped his head. Out of his peripheral vision, he could see a stag standing protectively in front of a doe. Padfoot knew her. He could sense her nervous muscles twitching, smell her electric fear prickling through the air. The wolf slowed and growled once, low and warning, and Padfoot dropped further to the ground, the dried leaves and pine needles crunching beneath him as he flopped onto his side, exposing his belly in a vulnerable, submissive position that belied his terrified, pounding heart. The wolf circled once, his eyes never leaving the dog, then approached on silent paws. He sniffed Padfoot all over, nose to tail, then licked once at his muzzle, testing. The wolf sniffed again, zeroing in on Padfoot's neck, then licked him all over, more excitedly this time. He licked across Padfoot's nose, under his chin, behind his ears, all around his muzzle, pressing and nosing at him joyfully and encouraging him to stand. Padfoot got to his feet, and their eyes met, gold and silver sparking together under the light of the hunter's moon in partial eclipse that night, a magic that existed before time. The wolf belonged to Padfoot, and Padfoot to the wolf. The stag pawed happily at the ground, bounding back and forth between the trees in joyous little bursts as he watched and waited, impatient to run. The wolf tipped his face toward the full moon and howled, long and loud. But for Padfoot, the sound no longer inspired fear. Instead, it filled his heart and warmed his whole body with a sense of home, of safety, of pack. The wolf nipped and licked at Padfoot again, then scented the air, turned, and ran toward the beckoning sea. The other three creatures followed, dog, doe, and stag, united or reunited from lifetimes past, Padfoot couldn't tell. But it didn't matter. They were together now. They ran in sync, these four of the forest, under the silver bright moon, weaving between tree trunks, leaping over stumps and fallen branches, scrabbling over jagged rocks as waves frothed and foamed over their feet and up their legs. They snacked on berries and sniffed at night-blooming flowers, pawed at the dirt and roots, and rolled in the sand, joyful and free. And when the moon had arced across the sky and the inky night was at its darkest, the wolf led Padfoot to a quiet spot tucked between two huge boulders, the ground soft with springy moss and sheltered from the wild forest. There they rested, curled into and onto each other, their bodies cushions and shields both, wrapped up and warm, pressed together all throughout the night. Usually, James gave Remus his privacy to untangle his mind and body from the wolf after waking up. James would wake first, conjure a blanket for Remus, make sure he had his clothes, and quietly slip away for a while. He'd be close by, of course, foraging for medicinal mushrooms for his next potions experiment, or skipping rocks over the waves at the ocean's edge while he waited for his best friend to gather himself. Remus always appreciated the privacy. Preferred it, actually. But still, it was cold and lonely, which only added to his pain upon waking. But this morning, when the sun cracked the edge of the horizon, the morning after the full moon, Remus was neither cold nor lonely. In fact, he felt strangely comfortable, curled up on a thick bed of moss under a heavy blanket and pressed against something soft and warm that curved against his back. He stretched his long limbs, and although they felt tired with sleep, there was none of the usual pain left over from cracking and reshaping bones and stretching skin. Instead, Remus felt a pleasant kind of ache, one of satisfying exertion and using your body for something good. He tipped his head to the side as he stretched and arched his back and neck, thinking that maybe he'd take advantage of this strange comfort to sleep a little more, when something cold and wet brushed against his bare shoulder. He rolled over and opened his eyes with a yelp, for there, curled up behind him, was an enormous shaggy black dog, fast asleep under the blanket with him, all stretched out as though he was sleeping in a king-sized bed.
What the fuck?
Remus cried and scrambled to his feet, grabbing the blanket and yanking it up to wrap around himself. The dog stretched and snuffled luxuriantly, utterly unbothered by Remus and his yelping. He opened one eye and gave Remus what could only be described as a sarcastic smirk, which could not be possible because dogs can't smirk and, as far as Remus knew, were incapable of sarcasm. Remus rubbed his eyes and shook his head a little, then took a step closer to the dog, which lifted its black head off the moss-blanketed forest floor and stretched open its mouth in a wide, decadent yawn. He tipped his head to the side with a curious tilt, gave Remus a cheerful good morning bark, then licked a wide wet stripe up the side of Remus's bare calf.
Ugh.
Remus shouted, staring down at the creature who was now looking at him with a definite spark of mirthful mischief in its eyes. Yes, this was a sarcastic dog. What the actual fuck?
Sirius,
Came a scolding voice and the sound of rustling footsteps.
you can't just lick people without saying good morning first.
Remus whipped around and jumped as the dog licked the back of his calf, too. Lily and James were picking their way slowly through the tall trees and tangled brambles and looking a bit disheveled. James's shirt was buttoned crookedly, Lily's cheeks were flushed pink, and they both had dried leaves stuck in their hair and on their clothes.
Lily Evans, have you been getting frisky in the forest?
Said a deep voice behind Remus. Remus whipped around yet again, and when his eyes fell to the forest floor this time, they landed not on the shaggy black dog, but on Sirius, who was lying sideways with his elbow on the ground and his head propped up by the heel of his hand. He was shaking his head at Lily with a wicked grin.
He's a 12-point stag, Padfoot.
Lily replied with a sheepish little smile.
I had to see what he was working with this morning.
And indeed, Remus now noticed that James and Lily were holding hands, and James had a slightly dazed, but absolutely thrilled, look on his face. Remus's mind was spinning with a million questions, but one was more pressing than the rest at the moment. He was the only one of them who was completely naked and shivering under a blanket.
James, have you seen my clothes?
He asked a little desperately.
Your clothes are that way.
James said, pointing to a tree about 100 feet away where Remus's clothes were, indeed, hanging from a branch.
I tried to bring them to you last night, but Mooney wouldn't let anyone near Padfoot or your little love nest.
James gestured to the mossy spot between the two boulders where Remus and the dog had woken up under the blanket. Remus's face burned as he glanced down at Sirius, who gave him a wink and a devious grin.
Okay, I'm gonna need a little background here, please.
Remus cried as James ran to grab his clothes from the tree. Remus dressed quickly, then they all settled onto the mossy ground so they could fill him in about the night before. James sat with his legs splayed open, and Lily scooched in between them. She pulled his arms around her waist and leaned back against his chest with a content little sigh. It was so different from how she'd treated him for the past couple of days, yet Remus hardly had time to wonder at it. He felt itchy and antsy again, like he wanted to jump out of his skin, despite the full moon having passed. He fidgeted uncomfortably on the ground until Sirius's foot brushed up against his ankle. Instantly, Remus's fizzing, buzzing body calmed, and a sense of serenity washed over him. It was the same feeling as the day before, when he'd been sick and sore, only to find immediate melting relief in Sirius's arms. Remus didn't say anything, but made sure to keep their bodies touching while they all talked.
Okay, first of all,
Remus said, finally pulling his sweater over his head and gathering himself a little as he looked at Sirius.
When did you figure out that James and I were wizards?
About 2 minutes after I met you.
Sirius said with a smug little grin. It made Remus's stomach flip pleasantly, despite his urge to also smack him.
What?
James cried, looking down at Lily.
You didn't tell me that.
We didn't do much talking just now, did we, James?
Lily said, elbowing him in the ribs.
I don't understand.
Remus said, looking at Sirius, dumbfounded.
Remus, or should I call you Mooney?
Sirius said with a playful shove to Remus's side that should have made Remus annoyed, but only made his skin warm where they touched.
Come on, it wasn't that hard to figure out. Remember when I told you I worked in law enforcement? I'm an aura for the Ministry of Magic. You transfigured a pen into a mouse about 6 inches from my face.
Shit.
Remus muttered as he remembered.
I also know that you've got an irritated ghost named Martha haunting your storeroom, and that you can make sunlight shine through a window with a flick of your finger, which is very, very hot, but not exactly subtle.
Sirius said.
In fact, you should probably be a little more careful, bringing muggles onto wizarding streets just for an easy shag. Honestly, besides, I would have shagged you no matter what, just so we're clear.
Crystal.
Remus replied weakly, shocked but deeply impressed with Sirius anyhow. He looked at James, who gave him a laughing shrug.
What I want to know,
Sirius continued,
is how you two figured out me and Lily.
Why, because you're some super spy.
James laughed.
Working for the government?
Well, yeah,
Sirius said.
Don't worry, James Bond, it wasn't you.
James told him.
It was this one.
He curved his arm around Lily's waist and gave it a squeeze before bending down to drop a teasing little kiss onto her cheek.
Me?
Lily squeaked.
Merlin's balls, what the hell did I do?
At this, Remus and James burst out laughing.
That?
James said.
You said that?
What?
Lily asked, wide-eyed.
Merlin's balls. You said it when you touched my arm on the roof at the Sphinx's riddle. I realized you were either a witch or that England has some really weird sayings. But we couldn't be sure, so we decided to keep an eye on you and take you to a no-mage haunted house. That way, we'd be on neutral ground. If there were any magical shenanigans going on, we'd know who was to blame.
We decided to act really scared the whole time, but the flying bats gave you away within minutes.
Remus added, wanting to give Sirius a taste of his own medicine.
Although I have to admit, by the time you vanished my apple cider, I really was starting to get very annoyed with you.
Sorry, Mooney?
Sirius said, rolling to the side and wrapping his warm hand around his ankle. Remus felt his whole body shiver with want, but he ignored it.
What about last night?
Remus asked instead, now feeling real fear and worry snake into his chest. What if he'd hurt them?
What happened?
Ah, a thrilling tale.
Sirius promised. And they told him about Sirius and Lily following them to the forest, their brush with death as the wolf pounced, and their last-minute transformations into the doe and the dog. As they spoke, bits and pieces came slowly back to Remus in a muddled fog, as though he was remembering snippets of a nearly forgotten dream. He remembered thinking that Prongs was in danger from these new creatures. He also remembered silvery eyes and black fur, and running. But mostly he remembered the scent of the black dog, who submitted to him immediately, ran beside him and curled up next to him all night. He smelled incredible, like leather, musk, and the wild seaside forest that reminded him so much of home and family. It was a scent he'd smelled before, and one he already knew and loved.
You're anime guy, both of you?
Remus gaped at Sirius and Lily, who both nodded.
But why did you do it?
James asked.
I mean, I did it for Remus, but it's not exactly easy.
Well,
Lily said, glancing over at Sirius, who nodded in encouragement, signaling that it was okay for her to keep talking.
Sirius had a really bad time of it at home when we were kids. I wanted to help him feel better, so I got special permission for us to study to become anime guy when we were 15. Animal emotions are less complex than human ones, and being an animagius can help with depression and anxiety. Our transfiguration teacher said it would take us at least 2 years to master all of the magic needed for the transformation, so she figured we'd be of age by the time we finished.
Sirius snorted a laugh and shook his head.
Silly, silly woman,
he said, giving Lily a fond smile.
How she underestimated us.
It only took us 6 months,
Lily said with a smile of her own, and Remus saw a little flush of pride color her cheeks.
We were the youngest recorded anime guy in the UK.
But not the world,
James said, and now it was Remus's turn to gloat with pride at his little boy genius best friend.
That title went to me, I was 14.
14, Merlin's balls.
Lily said, tilting her head up at him in admiration.
That's incredible.
Yeah, well,
James said with a noncommittal shrug, and Remus laughed to himself. James never quite comprehended just how amazing his magical abilities were. That's why Remus liked to take it upon himself to brag on James's behalf.
He's a bit of a genius,
Remus said, and he watched Lily's face soften even more into adoring awe.
Speaking of which, did you tell her about the $100 bill yet?
James's face reddened a little as he shook his head no.
Right. The protein charm.
Sirius nodded.
That's what it was, yeah?
Well, yes,
James said, his eyes darting to Remus.
but it was a little more than that, actually.
I figured it needed to be activated by something.
Sirius said thoughtfully.
I saw the numbers glowing, and they glowed even brighter when I touched it.
Something in Remus's stomach squirmed at his words, and he looked immediately at James, whose astonished expression mirrored Remus's thoughts.
They glowed brighter when you touched it.
James asked, his eyes wide and darting back and forth between Remus and Sirius.
That means it was activated by you too.
What are you on about?
Lily asked, and James squirmed a bit sheepishly.
I, modified a bit of rare magic so the protean charm would be activated when a soulmate bond was detected.
James told her, speaking very fast.
It became activated between me and you.
What?
Lily shrieked, twisting around to look at James.
Yeah, surprise.
James said with a shrug.
But, 2 other people also touched the money, and if it glowed for them too, that means...
Oh my God.
Sirius said quietly, looking at Remus.
Me and you.
He and Sirius stared at each other. Remus felt absolutely stunned, but only for a moment. In an instant, his surprise was eclipsed by writhing discomfort. His stomach churned, his skin crawled, and his brain fuzzed around the edges. Then he realized with a jolt that Sirius was no longer touching him. Instead, Sirius had jumped up and was pacing back and forth. He, too, now looked wildly out of sorts. He scratched at his arms and stretched his neck sideways, as though trying to work out a strained muscle. James and Lily were talking fast, probably about her shocking discovery that they were soulmates, but Remus couldn't hear them. He was too uncomfortable to think. His body thrummed with agitation.
Sirius, can you touch me again, please?
Remus blurted out, much louder than he intended. James and Lily's voices silenced as Sirius stopped his pacing. Remus saw Sirius's eyes register his distress and rushed over to him, crouched down, and took his hand. Immediately, Remus's muscles relaxed, and he could tell that Sirius's did too. Remus let out a heavy exhale and practically crawled into Sirius's lap.
James, what exactly was the rare magic that you used to detect the soulmate bond?
Sirius asked, a little breathlessly, as he wrapped his arms around Remus, and Remus noticed, sniffed his hair.
I tinkered with some Horcrux magic.
James said, and Sirius gaped at him.
Tinkered?
He repeated.
You don't tinker with Horcrux magic. Do you know how powerful that is?
Well, yeah, that's why I used it.
James said, but Sirius didn't look appeased.
What's the problem? I reversed the Horcrux magic. It's not like I murdered anyone.
It still fucks with your soul, though.
Sirius insisted.
What does Horcrux magic do? It rips your soul. So reversing would do the opposite. It would act like a magnet, pulling the soulmate's souls together.
And that's exactly what it did. What's the big deal?
James said.
We all found each other.
It did a little bit more than that, though, didn't it?
Sirius said.
I've wanted to sniff, lick, and climb Remus for 3 days. It got worse every time I touched him. Then he got sick, and I started to feel actual pain. I wanted to rip my skin off. That's why I followed you last night. And that's why right now, Remus and I both feel like shit if we're not touching each other. It's probably intensified because our animal selves can sense it too.
He untangled himself from Remus and pushed him away so they were no longer touching, as though to demonstrate, and immediately Remus felt his skin start to prickle again.
Hey,
he protested, and crawled back into Sirius's lap, settling against his chest and breathing him in deeply.
See?
Sirius said, and Remus could feel Sirius's body relax under him as they snuggled together.
And it's only going to get worse until we complete the magic.
How do we do that?
Remus asked, but he was only half listening. Instead, his eyes were drooping shut as he pressed his cheek into Sirius's chest.
Well, Horcrux magic is complete when the soul is ripped from murder,
Sirius said, thinking it through as he spoke.
So I suppose ours will be complete when the souls are brought together with love.
Meaning what?
James asked.
I think we need to shag,
Sirius replied as casually as though saying he needed milk from the convenience store. Remus burst out laughing, even as his body purred with the prospect.
What, like right here and now?
Remus asked, suddenly completely awake again.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, James and Lily. We need to ritually fuck in the forest to consummate our soul bond. Hope you don't mind.
Sirius brought his hands over his head and clapped once, hard and loud.
All right then. You heard the man. Clear off, Servids.
Sirius said, missing, or more likely ignoring, Remus's sarcasm.
We need to get busy.
No,
Lily interrupted.
you need to kiss. By all means, also shag.
Lily added quickly, seeing the outraged look on Sirius's face.
But James and I felt the same way. Not as bad, of course, since one of us wasn't turning into a werewolf. Once I kissed him, though, all those strange feelings just kind of settled.
But you shagged too.
Sirius protested.
That's not fair.
Again, 12 points, Padfoot.
Lily said, banging her hand on the forest floor on each syllable for emphasis.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
Remus said, finally taking matters into his own hands. He turned around and swung his legs over Sirius's hips to straddle him, took Sirius's face in his hands, and finally answered the urge his body had felt since nearly the moment they met. The result was immediate. The second their lips slotted together in a soft, slick slide, Remus felt a warm, tingling glow spread throughout his entire body, from the tips of his fingers and toes to the skin on his scalp. He could almost see the kiss sparkling and glittering around them, and his body sank into Sirius's as though they were actually melting together like molten gold, two becoming one. Sirius let out a little moan, and Remus knew he could feel it too, as his arms tightened around Remus's waist and he pulled them closer together. But Remus felt more than their souls bonding. There, too, was that burning, primal want that had fizzed within him any time he and Sirius were near each other, and soon, just having Sirius's body next to him was too much. Or maybe not enough. He pushed Sirius down so they were lying on the ground with Remus writhing on top of him. Sirius responded hungrily, hooking an ankle around Remus's calf and rolling his hips upward, their kisses messy and desperate.
Oi!
Lily yelled, flinging a large pine cone at them. It bounced off Remus's head and jolted him back to reality.
Hold it in, please. You've done your kissing. Wait to shag somewhere you don't have an audience.
Later, after they'd done exactly that, Sirius and Remus lay naked in Remus's bed, curled together under the blankets. Remus rested his head on Sirius's chest, while Sirius absently ran his fingertips across his bare shoulders in long, soft strokes. It felt wonderful, perfect, the rightest thing in the world, and Remus closed his eyes as he listened to Sirius's heartbeat against his cheek. Still, he couldn't keep his mind from wandering to the weekend and their imminent goodbye. His body must have tensed, or the soul bond was stronger than Remus realized, because Sirius stilled his fingers and kissed the top of his head.
What's wrong?
Sirius asked.
Nothing.
Remus lied.
You can't hide your feelings from a soulmate, Mooney.
Sirius said, and Remus tightened his hold around Sirius's chest.
That's just it.
Remus said,
We live on different sides of the ocean, and against all odds we still found each other. And now you have to leave.
Sirius was quiet for a minute as he resumed his stroking of Remus's shoulders.
I don't have to leave,
Sirius said finally. His voice was quiet and tentative, but also hopeful.
Wait, really?
Remus asked, lifting his head from Sirius's chest and staring at him. Sirius was so beautiful, it was still hard to focus on anything else. But Remus's heart was hammering yes, yes, yes in his chest, and he couldn't have hidden his joy if he tried.
Yeah.
Sirius said,
I told you I need a change. I'm desperate for one, actually. London is stifling. My job is mind-numbingly boring. My family is a nightmare. And I'm tired of being treated like I'm practically royalty wherever I go. Everyone kisses my arse, but I know they actually hate my guts. It's awful, really. And besides, Salem is pretty.
Remus crawled up Sirius's body, laying completely on top of him and settling between his legs.
I thought you said it was crowded, touristy, fake, and filled with swindlers.
Remus laughed, dropping soft kisses all over his neck and shoulders.
Well, yeah, it is.
Sirius said, and Remus laughed again.
But it also has beautiful architecture, an incredible history, and the ocean, and real magic just under the surface. And then there's the most important thing it has.
What?
Remus asked, and Sirius put a gentle hand to his cheek before giving his whispered reply.
You.
Epilogue Halloween, 1 year later.
Go fish,
Sirius said, trying not to sound too annoyed as a translucent hand reached to the pile of cards and picked one up.
Ah, fish my wish.
Martha said gleefully, waving an 8 of hearts over her head.
My turn again. Do you have any kings?
Yep.
Sirius sighed, practically flinging his 3 kings at Martha, but John Hathorne tutted at him.
You should be happy that Martha isn't sulking around the storeroom, upending potions ingredients and tormenting your house elf anymore,
he said, licking his thumb and rubbing it against a scuff on his black leather buckled boot. He licked again and rubbed harder, but it was a hopeless endeavor. That scuff had been there since 1717.
I am.
Sirius said testily.
I just wish it didn't come at the price of an eternity of playing Go Fish with you lot.
Like you know anything about eternity, living boy,
said the ghost of the hanged man, who fiddled with the noose around his neck. He still wouldn't tell them his name, like a ghoulish Rumpelstiltskin.
The colonists kept excellent records of their executions. Look it up yourselves if you're so fucking curious,
he admonished over and over again. John and the hanged man were already out of cards, but still very much engaged in the match. Who knew that teaching ghosts the world's stupidest card game would make them all so happy? Remus said he didn't even know Martha had teeth until the day he saw her smiling at Sirius as he explained the rules. Still, Sirius didn't realize that would mean he'd be required to play with them weekly.
Do you have any 3s?
Martha asked Sirius. He handed over his last 2 cards and couldn't help but smile as Martha squealed with delight, jumped up, and started dancing around the storeroom.
Careful, they'll hang you for that,
the hanged man said as he watched her hoist her skirts and apron into her hands and do a little jig.
Maybe they'd hang you for it,
she said with breathless happiness.
You're a Puritan, I'm a Congregationalist. Don't be a sore loser.
Don't be a sore winner,
the hanged man snapped back.
May plague kill your crop!
And he disappeared with a little gust of frigid wind.
I must be off too, Sirius,
Hathorne said, standing up and straightening out his breeches.
I've a cemetery tour to haunt.
Nice seeing you, Judge,
Sirius said with a little bow.
Likewise, young man. Give Remus my regards,
Hathorne answered, and he, too, left the storeroom in a whoosh of cold. Sirius waved a hand and the card table disappeared completely.
I did it,
he cheered. Remus had been teaching him wandless vanishing, but he still often ended up leaving behind at least a little piece of whatever he was trying to vanish, especially bigger things. Last week it had been the eyelashes of a haunted doll.
Excellent work, Sirius,
Martha said as she 2-stepped.
Enjoy your dancing, Martha,
Sirius called over his shoulder, walking into the apothecary side of the shop, which was absolutely bustling with activity. James and Remus were each handling a customer, but there was still a line of people waiting among the shelves, which were packed with jars, vials, boxes, and bags of potions, ingredients, and equipment.
What can I do, Moons?
Sirius asked, putting a hand on Remus's back and speaking low in his ear.
Hey, babe, can you help that hag in the corner?
Remus asked, sounding a little frazzled, and nodding over to the side of the shop near the blood and bones.
She's been here for a half hour, but won't let me or James help her. She keeps saying she wants the handsome one, and I'm guessing that means you. But don't give her any of your own hair, no matter how many times she asks.
Sirius nodded and made his way over to the hag, who was as grizzled as a rotting tree stump, had breath like dead fish, and attempted to cut a lock of Sirius's hair with a bloody dagger whenever his back was turned. Eventually, though, Sirius sent her on her way with a bag full of loose bones.
10 for $5 is a bargain anyway, you slice it, Grimhilda.
A magical cleaning solution for that filthy dagger, and some toothpaste, which he assured her wasn't just for humans. Finally, after nearly an hour, the shop had quieted and emptied, and James, Remus, and Sirius slumped against the counter, positively exhausted.
How's Lily feeling?
Sirius asked James, whose head was on his arms against the counter.
Ready to kill me and cut the baby out herself?
He answered.
I heard that. It's not my fault that this kid is overstaying his welcome,
said Lily's voice, her hugely pregnant stomach coming around the corner from upstairs before the rest of her did. She was positively waddling, but carrying a plate laden with pumpkin pasties. Sirius was happy she was passing the last few weeks of her pregnancy, obsessed with baking for some reason. James said it was because the dough was nesting, but Lily had only slapped his arse in playful punishment.
Here, eat these,
she said, holding the plate in front of them.
I made them with ginseng, ashwagandha, and a little charm I invented to give you lots some extra energy to get through the rest of today.
Remus looked at his watch.
Only 11 more hours until Halloween is over,
he said, reaching for a pasty with his thanks.
And then we can finally get some rest.
They ate the pasties gratefully, but not 30 seconds later, the bell on the other shop door tinkled, signaling customers in quoth the Raven. Remus looked at Sirius with a little whimper.
I'm tired, Pads.
Remus whined, and Sirius flung an arm over his shoulder as they shuffled through the storeroom, past Martha, who was regaling Winnie with the tale of her Go Fish win, and into quoth the Raven. A little knot of kids dressed as ghosts and witches stood in the middle of the shop, looking around with wide, frightened eyes while their parents perused a rack of Salem postcards. The children's gaze landed on Remus and Sirius as they emerged from the storeroom.
Why don't you take this one?
Remus said softly, dropping a little kiss on Sirius's cheek and handing him a pen.
Yeah?
Sirius asked.
Yeah, I think you're ready.
Okay.
Sirius said and approached the counter, feeling the soulmate bond tingling under his skin as Remus watched him. He took a deep breath and spoke.
Happy Halloween, kids.
Sirius said, twirling the pen between his fingers.
Who wants to see a magic trick?
Finite. Thanks for listening to this text-to-speech podfic composed by Burning Aurora.